Texas Governor Greg Abbott is clashing with the Biden administration over key immigration policies. He authorized state officials to arrest migrants who cross the border illegally and bring them back to ports of entry. Camilo Montoya-Galvez is here with us in Studio 57 to break this all down. Camilo, it's good to see you. So the federal government has the power to enforce immigration law. Does Governor Abbott have the authority to order actions like this?
It's unclear, Vlad. As you very well underscored, the enforcement of U.S. immigration law is a federal responsibility. U.S. law gives federal officials the power to arrest, detain, deport, give asylum to, or otherwise process migrants who are accused of federal immigration violations. And in a 2012 ruling, the Supreme Court partially struck down an Arizona law that expanded that state's ability to penalize and arrest migrants living in the country illegally, and said that the federal government has broad, undoubted power over U.S. immigration policy. So this is a very well-established legal principle. Governor Abbott is testing the limits of this legal principle that has been in place for decades as part of federal immigration policy. And because of that, this move could very well garner legal challenges in federal court. What is very important to note, and I was telling you this off camera, Anne-Marie, is that Governor Abbott so far is not crossing one line, and that is to deport migrants to Mexico. Such a drastic move would implicate our relationship with the Mexican government, which has to accept the return of migrants to its territory, and it would upend another well-established legal principle, which is that the federal government has the sole authority to conduct foreign policy.
You know, just to be clear on that, right? What you're not saying that if we return migrants who cross into the United States illegally to Mexico, that would jeopardize the U.S.-Mexico relationship. What you're saying is if it's not the federal government conducting these actions,
correct,
and it's the governor of the state of Texas conducting that, the governor does not have any diplomatic relationship with Mexico. That is done at the federal level, either through the Secretary of State or through the president himself.
Because the operational objective of Governor Abbott's directive is to instruct the Texas National Guard and the Texas Department of Public Safety to arrest migrants accused of federal immigration violations and to transport them to federal ports of entry, which are administered by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, a federal agency. It is not to send those migrants back to Mexico because, again, the state does not have the authority to deport people to foreign countries.
But some of these people are saying, I'm seeking asylum, right? And we have sort of a legal framework for people seeking refuge. So how is the governor, if he's explained it, determining who he's going to relocate to a port of entry and who gets to sort of continue along with the process? Well,
that's also unclear. The time frame and the scope of this latest directive by the governor still remain very unclear. We've asked a series of questions to the Texas National Guard and the Department of Public Safety, but they have not provided any operational details of how they will implement this order. They could very well start arresting single adults just because of the fact that it would be logistically, legally, and politically more difficult to start arresting unaccompanied minors or families with minor children. That could very well be the case, but it's unclear whether federal officials at these ports of entry will assist Texas in any way in implementing this order by accepting the return of those migrants and then processing them and returning them to Mexico. That is still an open question.
So throughout the course of modern American history, there have been many instances where a president of the United States has called a governor and told that governor to enforce the regulations or to implement federal law. Has the White House responded to this? Has President Biden called Governor Abbott to say, you are not the one who can make these decisions?
The White House did put out a statement on this latest order, and it said that it does not have any confidence in the potential success of this directive, and it cited several other border initiatives that Governor Abbott has already put in place, including secondary screenings of commercial trucks entering the U.S. that the governor implemented earlier this spring. He was forced to discontinue those screenings after this strong criticism from business leaders, the administration, but also some Republican lawmakers who highlighted the negative economic impact of those screenings, which slowed down cross-border traffic.
That's really interesting that it's sort of his own Texans that have said, listen, you know, this doesn't work for us. But I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the future. Camilo, thank you very much.
Thank you.